All right, so we're talking about the Dark Star Rising, your new book, and am I right? I only discovered your work fairly recently, but I have the feeling I'm going to be going through your back catalog. Am I right to say that this is a bit of a departure, and maybe now you're finding new audience that is coming for the politics rather than for the occult, esoteric stuff?
Well, I hope so. It's a new departure in the sense that it's more current events than
Hmm.
anything else I've written. I mean, I've written about politics and the occult before. Um, 10 years ago, 2008, a book of mine just called "Politics: The Occult" came out, and that was more of a historical study. And sort of the idea behind that book was that usually, if you talk about a relationship between politics and the occult, it tends to be put in the context of far right, politics. And I wanted to show, like, yes, while there is obviously that, there's also a kind of progressive occultism. You can find it in, people like Madame Blavatsky and so on and so on. So that was like sort of the aim of that book. But this one, Dark Star Rising, is different because it's about it is about a kind of occult politics that is seems to be happening on the far right, and it seems to be happening now or in recent times. So it's more of the moment,
Hmm.
and it's more sort of journalist or reportage sort of work than historical one. Although it has historical context and there's philosophy and so on. But I would hope that it could go outside of the occult niche, put it that way, or the alternative niche. And it seems to have reached some people. It got reviewed in Forbes, which I thought was like one of the first reviews was in Forbes magazine, which I thought was strange. But that was good. And there's some other things. But I think perhaps the sort of the magic tag may prevent people from sort of picking it up and touching it and all that. But I mean, it
Hmm.
has got some attention on sort of the wider kind of alternative fringe. So we'll see. It's been doing well, and I keep getting asked for interviews. So
And how is it getting perceived by the more, well, let's say the Forbes review?
Well, I mean, people like that. That's kind of like funny.
Right.
I forget the reviewer's name, but he enjoyed it. He said it was a very good read, and it's an interesting take on things. But of course, it's a kind of crazy idea, and it's not rational, and so on. And there were some others who again said the same kind of thing. And then there's some readers who are saying, "Oh well, the lefties will come up with anything to." Rationalize how Trump got elected. And in fact, I'm not a lefty. I'm not a righty. I'm not even in the middle. I'm just sort of reporting on all this sort of thing. So, and then you have people sort of feeling like I'm saying, oh well, you're saying that Trump couldn't have got elected under any kind of real,
Hmm.
honest kind of means. He needed to use black magic, and I'm not really saying any of the things. The whole idea is that there seem to be elements of that taking place around in the political world today. So I'm not necessarily arguing that magic put Trump into office, but I am saying it seems to be happening that there are some people that are participating in kind of magical practices that are involved in all this. But it's against a broader backdrop of a kind of almost metaphysical kind of condition, this sort of postmodern condition we're in now, where we've entered this post-truth and alternative fact world, in which you could say it's magical in the sense that the constraints on reality that
Hmm.
they're no longer in place, so anything can happen. And so it's this kind of idea that this sort of magical politics is taking place in this broader um, kind of world now, where the whole idea of reality has become very malleable.
Right. So you could almost interchange the words like magic with words like postmodernism or
Exactly,
post-truth.
exactly. I mean, there's, what I'm seeing is similarities between sort of postmodernism, chaos magic, which comes up in it, and this philosophy known as New Thought, which is about the idea that the mind creates reality and thoughts are causative. One branch of which, known as positive thinking, is something that Trump himself is
Hmm.
a devotee of. So it seemed all these sorts of things were happening at the same time, and they all seem to be based on this idea that the way in which we understood reality has changed, and things have become very different. And so I try to follow that trail, and it takes me to some very interesting places.
All right. So let's just take the first step into the through the looking glass or into the rabbit hole or whatever it is. Let's start. My favorite part from this whole milieu of peculiar ways of looking at things is Pepe the Frog and the adventures that it got into. And the first time I heard the connection between Pepe and chaos, I guess, was when Jordan Peterson tried to explain to Joe Rogan what Kekistan was. And let me jot down the narrative and you tell me if I got it right.
Okay,
so here's how Peterson put it. There were these people online who are kind of like internet hooligans, like to use different kinds of memes, draw a swastika or two here and there. And they were using this cartoon character, this cartoon frog named Pepe, in many of their memes. And then, of course, when amused by the results of those memes, they would use LOL, laughing out loud, which then they later discovered is kek in Korean, K-E-K. So they changed LOL to K-E-K. Then they discovered that kek is also the name of an ancient Egyptian god of chaos, who's also a frog. So the reaction to that, of course, was kek, right? And then the Free Republic of Kekistan was founded with god of chaos, Kek, or Pepe, as the leader of that imaginary world. And these people were supposedly instrumental to, or at least to some extent, instrumental to Trump's victory of the presidency. So is that all right?
I think you got it. I mean, the only thing I'd add is that one of the things that happened to sort of cement this was that, the thing about Kek, it was sort of a glitch in this World of Warcraft video game, and it had to do with the Korean language. So whenever they wanted to, type LOL, it came up KEK.
I see.
And so they just gave up and just did KEK, and then they picked it up, and then subsequent they realized, somebody said, oh my God, Kek is this Egyptian, frog-headed god of chaos. And then, but the other bit of this was that when they were posting, on 4chan, it's anonymous. You don't have a name, but you're given a number, and it's an 8-digit number. And the people posting about Pepe and Trump and all that, they were seeing that they were getting double numbers or triple numbers or 4 numbers in a row, in the same 8-digit sort of signature. And they kept betting whether they were going to get one or not. And it seemed that they were getting some kind of approval or some kind of acknowledgement from the internet god in some way. So every time they posted about Pepe, it would come up a trip or a dub, and then all this kind of thing. And then there's a famous meme with Pepe as Kek, and there's all numbers around him, and this kind of some kind of coded symbol and all that. But yeah, I mean, this is remarkable synchronicities, and that's what I tracked it down. And I mean, the other strange thing that didn't get mentioned at the time was that, as you said, KEK came out of the Korean language, and then Trump, one of the things he started getting into was Kim Jong-boom, as it were, and this whole Korean thing. So it another layer to these strange synchronicities took place. But no, you pretty much nailed it. I mean, and this is the kind of thing I've run through so many times. I was glad that you did it so that I didn't have to say it, because I've said it so many times in interviews recently. But yeah, that's exactly it. Yes.
So let's say we can start with that part of the story. What is how do I put it? When looking at that and attaching terms like chaos magic or meme magic to it, are you yourself looking at this as kind of like, hey, that's a peculiar way of looking at things? Or are you granting this kind of thinking some sort of agency and real influence on the situation?
Well, I leave it open because it seems to be part of a complex of things happening at the same time. I mean, I was talking about our ideas about reality becoming very flexible, in this post-truth world, in this postmodern world. And it's something I call trickle-down metaphysics, where, and put it in a nutshell, Nietzsche in the late 19th century predicted this kind of nihilism that was on its way, and it was unavoidable. And he said it wasn't for today, and it wasn't going to happen tomorrow, but it was going to happen the day after tomorrow. And I think that this is us. And I think the sort of nihilism that he saw from the metaphysical heights has finally trickled down to the sort of everyday lowlands. And, we've sort of inherited this sort of relativity. All values are relative, all truths are relatives, all realities are relative, and beliefs and all that sort of thing. And we inhabit this kind of world where there is no truth with the capital T anymore. And this was something that worried Nietzsche, but we seem to have kind of plunged into it, and people are taking advantage of it. And so, and the other side of that is the whole interchange between reality and its representation in television or on the net and all that. And
Right.
It's a cliche by now, but the most popular thing on television is reality TV.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even reality television shows about people who watch reality television shows. So it becomes this kind of, doubly self-reflective kind of mirror kind of thing. And it seems that the simulacra, the simulation of reality is becoming increasingly more and more vivid and more, real. We have HD, 3D, all this sort of thing. So it strikes me that we're putting all this reality into the represented world, into the television. And to put it in a funny way, it seems it's going to get crowded in there, in that space, and something's going to have to pop out. And that's what I sort of think of as Trump, because he was a reality television celebrity for many, many years, in precisely the kind of position that he is now as leader of the country. He was the boss in this, The Apprentice and all that. He did exactly the same thing, hired and fired, wore the suit, and looked like very strong leader figure. So he sort of popped out of that status of being in this represented world into the actual world. And so I'm putting all this magic within there. And the reason I keep my mind open about it is because the one thing I will accept and I will say that I believe is true is synchronicities. And this is, C.G. Jung's term for what we call meaningful coincidence. When something happening in your head, you see outside in the external world, but there's no causal relationship, but it has a deep, meaningful one. And it's so obviously meaningful that we can't just say it's just coincidence. It's something that has a real sort of effect on us. And what seems to be happening with Pepe and the net and the meme magic and all that is that kind of strange phenomena of meaningful coincidence between my imagination and the world seem to be taking place between the internet and the world and the real world. And we think of the internet as a kind of collective exteriorized imagination. Then we can transfer the same kind of phenomena to it. And that seems to be what happened, right? The 4chan people started seeing all these kind of coincidences between their Bain posting about Dark Knight Rises and, the tragic Germanwings 9525 flight. They saw coincidences there. And so it seemed, wow, if this was happening by itself spontaneously, can you make it happen? And that's, I would say, the essence of magic is can you induce synchronicities? They happen by themselves, but can you make them happen? And that pretty much is what sort of magic, in a broad sense, chaos magic, in a more specific sense, but also the kind of new thought and positive thinking that Trump is, saturated in, that he grew up in. It doesn't use magic per se in terms of ritual, but the whole idea that the mind can create situations in reality, can arrange reality for you. And it's very much along the same lines of inducing some kind of synchronicity and so on. And one of the other things that struck me is very interesting about both chaos magic and new thought and positive thinking is that they're all sort of results driven. They're very practical. They're very utilitarian. It's very much about making something happen in the real world. From the new thought, positive thinking side, it's all about sort of the gospel of prosperity and, wealth and health and all of that. The chaos magic side, this kind of started up in the 70s around the same time as punk. And these people were just fed up with all the Golden Dawn and even the Crowley kind of magic, which is all about kind of, states of consciousness and contacting your higher holy guardian angel. And they were bored to tears with that. And they wanted something, happen. And they wanted, let's make something happen, make that guy fall down or make money come tomorrow in the mail or something. And so it just got stripped down to doing that, much like punk. Punk, was about just, raw, basic kind of energies and things. So, but it too is very results driven. It's very much about, some kind of, and there's even a famous chaos magic book called The Book of Results, which could be a title for a new thought sort of thing. So again, there's similarities. There's sort of kind of similar styles and kind of character to all these sorts of things happening at the same time. And so, but because I've had enough synchronicities in my own experience, and I've been reading about this stuff for 40 years. I just accept that, okay, that they do happen. They are a phenomena in the world. I don't know how they happen, and I'm not convinced by any particular account, and whether it's quantum physics or something else. But I do accept them phenomenologically as something that actually takes place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think if you accept that, then I can't. My intellectual integrity leads me to say that I'm not compelled to categorically deny the possibility. But did it happen for sure? I don't know, and there's no way you could know. But I just find it interesting that there's this one incident, the one that sort of got this going was with Richard Spencer and his sort of declaration to the annual meeting of the National Policy Institute that happened just about a week or so after Trump's election, where he opened this meeting. And the National Policy Institute is this kind of harmless name for a group that many people consider to be very white supremacists and mm-hmm. so on and so on. But he started this meeting by saying, "Hail Trump! Hail our hero! Hail our victory! We made this happen. We dreamed this into reality. We willed Trump into in the White House." And they talk about their victory of the will. So he's taking responsibility for this. And this was covered in all the newspapers and on the media and CNN, and it wasn't just in some weird, you might not have got it there, but it was certainly.
No, I think it
was in the news. And the reason it was in the news was not so much for that as for the response from the crowd, because they started giving the sort of,
right.
National Socialist salutes and so on and so on. And that got, in more or less headlines. And, but one fellow who picked up on this was a fellow named Harv Bishop, and he writes about New Thought, and he has a blog about New Thought. And he heard what Spencer was saying, and he's basically thought, my God, this is exactly what New Thought is about, making dreams reality. Not in the broad metaphorical sense, but in actual concrete, results-based sense.
Do you think Spencer was using when he said would dream Trump into reality?
Well, this was the idea. This was what got the whole thing going.
Uh-huh.
He seemed to be doing that, and then it turned out that the way of doing it was through using Pepe on the internet. Pepe was somehow a kind of magical symbol.
Mm-hmm.
He became it's known as a sigil, and it's this kind of, and that's the thing about chaos magic, where it differs. It doesn't use the old, sigils and symbols and all the kind of magical spells and all of the traditional, implements of ceremonial magic. It's more like kind of, postmodernism, where it just grabs whatever's at hand and puts it together. And so chaos magic sort of makes up its own spells, and it does its own magic kind of, on the run. It kind of just thinks on its feet, as it were. And this is what they were doing. Instead of using, sort of things in the 3D world, they were using internet memes. And so the idea was to somehow Pepe, he's charged with all this intention and will and imagination, and they have memes of him, with Trump looking over the Mexican border. There's one of the deplorables. There's a meme of him like as Trump, and so on. And the whole idea was to saturate the net with that, and that where before it happened spontaneously, somehow the combined intention or just the saturation, something would happen, and hey, Trump got elected. They even thought that they were responsible for something happening to Hillary Clinton. There was the 9/11 memorial that she attended, and she was suddenly ill at it, and they thought that she had somehow offended Keck, or Keck had somehow. So I mean, there's no way you can know whether it's true or not, but in the context of all these other things, so you have that. You have these guys being interested in New Thought. You've got Trump himself, a devotee of positive thinking. Trump himself is like a natural chaos magician. If you look at his whole style, I mean, the one word that characterizes Trump's administration, I would say, is chaos. There's probably a few others, but that would be one of the ones that many people would say. And what struck me in the book is that his own natural style seems to be much like the kind of techniques or the practices that the chaos magicians, are supposed to pursue and to work their magic. And again, it's very results based. And the whole idea that reality is malleable, the whole idea that you can create your own reality, that beliefs are something that you put on and take off the same way you do clothes. Truth is something that is, you use. It's a tool. These are all things that Trump just does naturally. He doesn't, he doesn't adhere to any kind of, I'm sure he never heard of chaos magic. And in saying this, in no way do I want to stigmatize chaos magicians. I'm not saying that they know about this or they, accept it or even would want it. I'm sure they wouldn't want to be associated with them, probably. But he seems to do it naturally. And then you get the connection with Keck being the god of chaos and so on and so on. So all these strange, in proper synchronistic kind of way, all these strange things seem to kind of be caught in this kind of swirl of stuff. And that the other sort of big kind of clue that came soon after Trump's election was this article that the New York Times ran about a talk that Steve Bannon gave to a group in the Vatican. Mm-hmm. The article came out in February 2017, and the talk was in 2014, before Trump had declared his intention. But it was to a group called the Human Dignity Institute, that are a select group of very conservative sort of churchmen. So, any case, in the midst of his kind of general talk about the global Tea Party movement and traditional values and fighting Islamic fascism, one of the things that Steve Bannon did was he name-checked Julius Evola. Now, if you know who Julius Evola is, this is a strange thing, and this was so in the headline more or less of the New York Times article. And Evola was this 20th century esoteric philosopher who also had leanings towards the far right. He tried to ingratiate himself first with Mussolini, then he tried to do the same with National Socialism. After the war, he was this kind of intellectual figure in the background whose ideas informed very different sort of neo-fascist, new right movements in Italy. And subsequent to that, since his death in the early 70s, he's been this kind of, he's been sort of rediscovered by a kind of right-wing branch of kind of esotericism. And he's one of the intellectual figures that the alt-right points to as one of their sort of sources for their own ideas that make them different than just skinheads and rednecks and white power people and all that. So so you have Steve Bannon, who became one of Trump, a close advisor of Trump, at least during his campaign and in the early days of his administration. He's name-checking this esoteric philosopher who, ingratiated himself with far-right politics. It looks like you want to ask me something.
Yeah, when you say name-checking, what do you mean exactly? What is the context in which?
Well, I'll get to that. And in the course of this talk he gave, he was talking about Putin. He was talking about Vladimir Putin, and he was sort of praising him and also saying he was wary. But one of the things he liked about Putin is that Putin was standing for traditional values, traditional sort of social roles and gender roles and family roles and so on, against the kind of hyper liberalism and sort of individualism of the West. And in the midst of talking about Putin, he says he has someone around him. There's someone in Putin's circle who reads Julius Evola. Mm-hmm. And he kind of conflates the whole idea of traditional values and this philosophy known as traditionalism, which is the philosophy that Evola basically is a exponent of, and who Bannon is referring to when he's sort of mentioning Evola is Alexander Dugin, who is someone who's around now, and at different times he's been believed to have more or less influence, or his ideas of it's always kind of uncertain exactly how much influence he's had on Putin or how much his ideas have got there. But in any case, he's the person who Bannon was sort of alluding to. And again, Dugin is into chaos magic. Dugin, if you've seen any of sort of some photographs of him and some videos, he often has the kind of chaos, the 8-pointed chaos star in the background. Yeah. And one of the youth groups that he sort of founded, a kind of very nationalistic group. They had, it was the Eurasian Youth Organization or something along those lines. They had the Chaos Star on their T-shirts and all this kind of thing. And he too practices, or at least has written about, a kind of mental science, a kind of the idea that thoughts can affect reality. And this was something that Evola did too in the 1920s. In fact, Evola if indeed Spencer and the alt-right did try to put Trump into office, they were doing exactly what Evola was doing in the 1920s when he tried to influence Mussolini. Not to put him in office, he already was in power, but what he wanted to do was to try and imbue Mussolini's fascists with the ancient Roman noble virtues, because he didn't think the Italians were particularly good material to work with. And so he and other members of this group called the UR group in the 1920s, who wrote in this journal they had under different pseudonyms, they practiced these sort of rituals to try and, project these kind of virtues and kind of characteristics into the Italian fascists. So again, the same kind of thing was going on. So again, it's another part of this sort of puzzle where each little bit gets a little bit closer and closer to each other. Chaos, magic, new thought, right. The right wing kind of comes in. And again, it's happening in Russia as well. So that was kind of, once I looked at the first thing, once I looked at Spencer and then Bannon, and then my editor at the time at Penguin, Mitch Horowitz, who's since gone on to other things, he basically said, well, something's up, something's going on now, isn't it? Because all this strange esoteric material that's usually on the fringe, on the margin, had got into the mainstream. It doesn't happen every day that the New York Times talks about Julius Evola. And certainly not in the context of a close advisor to the recently elected president of the United States, who we know has very strong right-wing views, and so on and so on. And, reading articles in like Foreign Affairs or The Economist and other, more mainstream, very level-headed, sober magazines about Dugin. They call him Putin's Rasputin, which is an exaggeration. But again, it's that kind of thing. And suddenly it's like, again, all this very, very stuff that I've been reading about myself for the last 20, or reading about it for 40 years. I've been writing about it for at least 20, but it was always on the side. Now it's like, oh my God, it's right there. And so that's when my editor commissioned me to write this. So I tried to capture the moment, because what I felt actually was that history had caught up, because I've been writing about sort of the influence of this esoteric counterculture on the mainstream over for the last 400 years. And now it's thought to be, oh God, exactly what I've been talking about is happening, because my own belief is that, we've marginalized this irrational, whatever you want to call it, mystical, and sort of kept it on the side. And now instead of integrating it in a positive way, in a way that's creative and can push us forward, it's come back. But it's come back in a way many of us are not quite, at home with. We don't feel comfortable with it. And that's one of the things I say in the book. I say in some way, the occult community, let's say the occult friendly community that I'm a part of, we too have kind of wanted, the kind of Western logical scientific ideas about truth and rationality and all of that to be a bit loosened. We find them too strict and, too reductive and too limiting. And so we too wanted them to be sort of loosened up a bit, just like the postmodernists, just like the chaos magicians, just like the new thought people. And okay, that has happened, but it's not happened in quite the magical way that, many of us would have liked to have happened. And so, but, that's why in the book I kind of half tongue in cheek refer to Trump as the singularity. Because the singularity is this event horizon where our normal ideas about reality stop and break down. So a black hole, time and space are very different. And then in this sort of new age millenarian idea that there's a singularity somewhere down the line in history, and when we reach there, conditions on Earth will be very different. We'll be in a golden age again or something like that. Well, I think Trump's election has been a singularity in the sense that, as I say, all of our ideas about truth and reality and fact and fiction have folded in on each other and become all topsy-turvy. And the world's very different since since they're not in some necessarily metaphysical sense. There's still time and space, but how we understand things and how we use language. And it strikes me that we are baffled and confused by things now that not too long ago we would have had very kind of clear ideas about, but now we sort of we don't. Is that true? I don't know.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
all so we hesitate now to make sort of and it's a very divisive time too. It's a very explosive, polarized sort of time. So,
I
yeah.
felt when Trump was elected, the sense I was getting from my American friends, the confusion, and they were baffled with this new reality, and the reality itself seemed to me quite similar to the 90s in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah.
And it's like the previous reality seems to be fallen apart, or in the case with Russia, completely fell apart, and there's nothing to replace it exactly. And so all of these new things are coming out, from the cracks.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm really curious about your take on Dugin, because that's the environment that he kind of established himself, I guess.
Yes, yes.
And I think his project is to offer something, to suggest something to replace the previous reality that disseminated.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Now with Dugin, do you see? We were talking about the chaos magic and Pepe the Frog and all of that, and a big part of that is it's supposed to be funny. It's like it can't be taken completely serious. There's a lot of it's the shit posters who are the name of the people who are doing that. Do you see a similar kind of quality in Dugin's work? Because I've seen him. I haven't researched him, but he's been in the background. I would see him on television every now and again. Yeah. And on the one hand, he is this, very conservative man with a beard, looks like an Orthodox priest or something.
He's an old believer.
Right. And he's, quite serious in his tone, but not uncommon for him to say something. I think I remember once on television, he was, presented as an expert on geopolitics and a philosopher and all of that. And he was being asked about, like, what's your... how do we save Russia? What's the answer to, heal our country? And his answer was something like, well, you know what we've lost? Peasants in old Russia would get into a circle and hold hands and run around in a circle. And it's like a traditional kind of dance type thing for celebrations. And we're not doing that enough. If we just run in circles more, and then there are connections because this somehow relates to like solar symbolism and connection to the archaic world and If we just ran around in circles holding hands more, it's difficult to imagine, Russian people watching that, taking that very seriously.
Yeah. Well, I think from what I understand, I mean, I've seen some things on the net. Some interviews, and I've read quite a bit, and I read about him, and I get the feeling that he's a bit of a showman. Again, like Trump to a certain degree, he knows how to use an audience, and I mean, my understanding that he started out as this sort of punk, dissident in the 80s,
right,
and playing guitar, and even then again, from what I understand, he sort of had a certain look. He had the guitar, and he sort of dressed in a very kind of bohemian way, and had a hair, strange haircut and all this kind of thing. And so I get the feeling he always had, he always aware of how his appearance and the impression he makes and that kind of thing and all that. And then, just following the different sort of political changes he's made, he's put of national Bolshevism and then Eurasianism and a variety of other things. So I think he says outrageous things for effect. I think what I can gather from what I've read, I think he's sort of, I think he knows what he's doing. I think he knows what he's doing when he's making that effect. And so again, that's kind of an element of kind of magic as well. You sort of you go in wanting to have make a certain kind of impression on your audience, and I think he does that sort of thing. But I think it is true that he's sort of reaching back into these ancient old, folkloric kind of traditions in order to root, this Russia, as you say, has been kind of without an anchor. It's, this is quite some time now. This is like almost 30 years, now it's been in different sorts of ways. So I think he's trying to do that. But no, I think there is an element of where he's kind of saying things that, but again, that's the whole sort of postmodern thing. Oh, are you really a Nazi? Oh, well, did you really think I was serious? And then if you ask that, then somehow you you weren't hip enough to know that it was just a joke.
Right.
But to me, that's a sort of like kind of, a disclaimer. It's a kind of, personal deniability. You and you don't quite, because he, again, he makes these outrageous statements, and then he often says something that's very different, and he kind of, if you sort of, pin him down to something, he'll say, oh no, I was just joking, it was just kind of a joke, and can't you take it, you're too serious, kind of thing. So that's kind of an all-purpose way to avoid, taking responsibility for, some of the things. Especially, I know, some of his more outrageous statements about National Socialism and things of that sort. But, I mean, but he also, during the Ukraine, episode, he made that famous statement that cost him his job at the university, where someone asked him, what should we do? And he said, kill them. And he meant the Ukrainians. And this was something like, so he probably, he's a loose cannon. He probably, sometimes explodes, and he doesn't quite, maybe makes something that's a bit injudicious. But I would say if he acts like a holy fool sometimes in the way of saying, crazy and outrageous things, there's probably a tactic behind it. But that's just my guess from sort of, reading, because I think he knows. Again, he was a conspirologist. He was a professional conspiracy theorist for a newspaper in Russia, and so he's very much knows how to create something that, again, this whole idea that you create a reality. It doesn't really matter if it has any kind of basis in fact anymore. It's whether you can get people to understand it and accept it.
Two things came to mind while you were talking. One is, it almost seems like this element of this all might be a joke might be one of the kind of prerequisites in the modern day to use these like magical ideas, or like we can't just straightforwardly go into we're doing magic now. That's crazy. But if there's a kind of chicken tongue disposition to it, we're just playing on the internet, then you can experiment with it in a kind of a safe.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I also think if we do live in a magical world, which, as I said, I accept the reality of synchronicities. So to some degree, I accept that we do. These things can happen by themselves too. And you might be playing around with it. You might be thinking you're just doing this for fun, but there's something else that might. Again, Keck was saying, yes, do more of that. Yes, here's another trip. Here's another double. Here's another quadruple. do more. And it's sort of like, I'm growing. I'm getting bigger. I mean, that's again. I'm. Is it really happening? I don't know, but it's a possibility. I mean, I'm in this kind of world, so I try to keep a level head about it. At the same time, I try to keep an open mind, because I mean, how do you explain when these things spread? I mean, how do you explain when Trump, in a way, he was kind of like a sleepwalker in one sense. I mean, I when I first heard that he put his hat in the ring, as they say in America, when he decided to run, I thought he was going to win. Only because I thought, yes, it makes perfect sense that a reality TV star would become president of the United States these days. So it just seemed like that was going to happen. I didn't want him to. I didn't particularly want Hillary Clinton to be president either. But I thought better the evil or the devil than. But other people thought differently. No, let's shake things up.
I had that feeling.
Upset the apple cart, and I think that's what many people wanted, and people just wanted that to happen. That's another thing too, which I didn't really talk about in the book. But there's this mystical idea about change, and something happens in society at a certain point where people just get tired of whatever is happening, and they just want change, whatever it is. And at that point, they're open to whatever might happen, regardless of the consequences. Things have become so stuffy and stagnant that they just want that. And I think that in many ways is what, that was the wave that swept Trump in. And, the alt-right and all these other people were part of that too, because that's why they got behind him. They just wanted to, sort of knock things over and, clear the deck so that, something new can happen. And again, that's the chaos. That's the chaos the chaos that precedes the new dawn. And that's the other side of Keck. Keck was the god of chaos, but he also was sort of the god that presaged the new dawn, the sun rising again. And so Trump may not be the main figure. He may be a kind of character who, creates the conditions for something else to take place. We don't know. Again, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is a possibility.
I saw, I think on your Twitter, I don't know what you were referring to, but you floated the idea of Trump being a tulpa, not even a real human.
Well, a tulpa is a kind of thought form. We're talking about thoughts are things, and thoughts are causative. And so not only can you make things happen, you can kind of actually create a reality in the sense that you can project an image from your mind out into the real world. And the famous story was told by this French explorer, this fantastic woman named Alexandra David Neal, in the early 20th century. She was one of the first, if not the first, sort of European woman to get into Lhasa in Tibet. Matt Blavatsky said she'd been to Tibet, but we don't know for sure. But Alexandra David Neal did go there, and she studied with these monks for a long time. And part of this Tibetan magic is this idea of creating thought forms. And she writes about this in this fantastic book called Magic and Mystery in Tibet. And she tells how the monk taught her how to create a thought form. And what she did was she created a monk. She sort of imagined him, visualized him very, vividly and intensely in her mind, and then gradually could see him outside, in the real world. And then gradually, she said, he took on a life of his own and sort of got out of her control. And the other monks in the monastery said, well, you have to do something about this. You have to do something about this because your monk is going around. He's getting into lots of trouble. He's doing lots of things. And so she had to somehow sort of reabsorb him. And this idea with the tulpa, it takes on a life of its own, and you have to kind of, get it back in. And I sort of, again, tongue in cheek, I sort of say, well, can we consider Trump a tulpa? Is he kind of this thought form that's been created? In a way, he was almost 50% there because, again, he already was inhabiting the electronic world of the, the alternate reality, which is becoming more and more real. And the once real reality is becoming more and more strange. And so we sort of his believers, his devotees, his Trumpians, they somehow pulled him out of the the electronic world, and there he is. But now, has he got out of control? Is he not? Is he not? Has he gone on his own? And
who's going? I don't know if he ever was under control of anybody.
Well, I know. I'm just saying it's a joke. It's a half. But at the same time, it's like, well, can we? Is this a metaphor we can kind of use to sort of understand what's going on? So, we'll see. I don't know. I mean, I did tweet him and mentioned the book to him, but I haven't heard. I haven't heard back, so I don't know.
It'd be interesting to hear his take. Yeah. You mentioned, chaos as a thing that precedes a new, some new form, and I think I've heard you talk about your new project. You're going to be working or are working now on a book about Russian. What is it? Search for Russian identity.
Well, it's sort of the idea of the rise or the return of Holy Russia.
So that's why I got it right then. So
it seemed to me that Putin is sort of going in that direction.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And as you say, Dugin has been there already, for a while. So
right, and so then if I try to continue my comparison between post-Trump America and Russia of the 1990s, the chaos of 1990s is now leading to this new idea of Holy Russia, a new vision of Russia that Putin and perhaps Dugin, other people are trying to put together.
Yeah.
Are you following these people who are supposedly put Trump in place? Do you think there is something that's supposed to come after the chaos of Trump?
I don't know. I to tell you the truth, I haven't sort of kept up with stuff there so much because I did that book, and then because I felt there was so much stuff happening in Russia, and because I just the whole, as you say, the whole story of Russia, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and everything you've gone through, it just struck me as so fascinating, and so and in a way, it just I wanted to understand more, and it just seemed to me this was. I don't know. I mean, I don't really. In a way, I'm not that interested in what's happening in the States. That sounds strange, but there is something. I've always been very interested in Russian philosophy, Dostoevsky and Berdayev and people like that, and the Silver Age. And what's fascinating now, what I discovered and what made me want to do this is that Putin seems to be referring in his speeches, more recent speeches, to people from the Silver Age, people like Berdyaev and Soloviev, and Ivan Ilyin, and people like that. And these are, these are important. I mean, it's not the power of positive thinking. I mean, the Trump power of positive thinking. It's a nice book. It's very, motivating, but it's not demanding philosophy. And I don't know how much Putin himself, can read of Soloviev, but the fact that he supposedly asked his regional governors to read these works struck me as, oh, that's very interesting. And again, reading articles in Business Week and The Economist and other ones, Foreign Affairs, it seems like the Western diplomats they're not really caught up to what he's doing. They don't really quite get the idea that he's taking this traditional values sort of thing and the Holy Russia thing seriously. This is the whole idea where there isn't an ideological battle anymore, and actually there is. There's the decadent West and this the traditional society that Putin seems to want to, make Russia. And again, that's part of this whole history of Russia. The whole idea that it's the third Rome. It's taken on the mantle of the true Christian, mission after the fall of Rome and Constantinople. And all that's fascinating to me again because it has this apocalyptic sense to it, this messianic sense, and again, it's a sense of history kind of coming to a head, and it does seem to be things are changing. It isn't the century of the United States anymore. NATO is getting very shaken up. I don't know. I'm in no way a politician or geopolitical thinker, but it does seem that Putin is sort of stretching things out a bit and seeing what happens and all that. So, just as someone who has been more interested in history, to suddenly feel like it's kind of it's caught up, and now I can say this is happening now. So, and it's just been fascinating for me to go back and read people, but also to read a great deal that I hadn't read about Russian history, and not to sound patronizing, but it strikes me that Russia has history in the way that England doesn't have a climate. England has weather. In the sense that there isn't a climate in England, there's weather. You get everything, and it's mostly rain and all that. But in Russia, it doesn't have a history as it has so much all of the elements that make up history, in the sense of wars and catastrophes and revolutions and just invasions and all this sort of thing. And it's just this incredible kind of vast landscape. No, I mean, in a way, I wish I could go on actually just doing the research, but I have to start writing the book. And actually, as we speak, I'm going through my notes now. I'm just sort of been thinking over, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's the idea, sort of like this. That's the general idea. I don't have a actual title just yet, but it's sort of this return of Holy Russia, and also things like the influence of Freemasonry in 18th century Russia was, around the time of Catherine the Great, before she sort of banned it and all that. It was incredibly very influential, and it's out of that sort of tradition that people like Madame Blavatsky come, because her great grandfather was part of that kind of Russian Rosicrucian Freemasonry in the late 18th century. And again, it had political plans, this whole notion of sort of redrawing the map of Europe. And so it's a very, very interesting kind of, how should we say it, introduction to this whole other way of looking at, history, say, for the last 1,000 years.
Have you ever looked at the Russian cosmists?
Oh yeah, I've just been reading about them. Fedorov is going to be in there, and Sulkovsky, and there's a wonderful book by George Young.
I did a couple of interviews on this site.
Oh yeah, no, fantastic stuff. Yeah, and no, that's. I mean, and I remember that this British writer John Gray, he did a book a few years ago called The Immortalization Commission, and he has a whole section on the God Builders, and the cosmists come in there as well. No, I mean, it's incredible. I mean. Another thing I have in mind is a kind of book about transhumanism, but that's a couple. That's just an inkling of an idea, but it would bring in a lot of the cosmos kind of stuff and all that sort of thing.
Well, I'll definitely be looking forward to this. So the reason I brought up cosmos is I thought that's another attempt at creating a coherent vision, a place for Russians in the world, but also a way of looking at reality. And I think if I'm not mistaken, that also like the school of thought, the thinkers themselves, started with the 19th century, but the umbrella term cosmos was invented something like late 80s. So it's also a time of, I think it's like the beginning of the search for a new vision, because the previous one was kind of dying out at that time.
Well, I mean, it's, again, I have to say, I mean, I grew up, I was a baby boomer, and for, up until, well, I guess until the late 80s, the Russia, the Soviet Union was there. It was this, powerful entity, and then the whole idea that it just almost overnight, wasn't there. That it happens, things that seem absolutely stable and without doubt, are going to exist can just change, and that's who knows. So who knows? This may be the century of the new Russia, of Eurasia. Who knows? Maybe Dugin's right. Who knows? We'll see what happens.
Another thing that I thought of, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes ago when you were talking about Dugin, I saw an interview with him where, so he uses postmodernism, like the way he relates to the term is, he thinks it's a bad thing and we don't want to get there. Luckily, Russia, he thinks, I don't think he even considers Russia a modern, like in the stage of modernism.
Yeah.
So he's like, we need to figure out, if we go the route that the West went, then we're going to end up in this postmodernism reality, and we don't want to get there.
Yeah.
But then he says, the part that I found curious is he says we can use, now that postmodernism exists, we can use it as a weapon against itself.
Yeah,
so we can use it as a tool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he himself. I mean, again, he's a contradiction, which is, I guess, many ways, this essential to postmodernism, and also chaos magic, where you have things that could be, radically different or somehow put together in some strange way, because there's no rules anymore. So, I mean, he brings together traditionalism and postmodernism. And he's postmodern to me in the way he kind of plays with different ideologies and puts them together like Lego blocks.
Right.
He sort of takes here's some National Socialism, here's some Bolshevism, here's some of Stalin, and let's put that in there and see what happens with that. So that strikes me as postmodern. But yes, this kind of traditionalist metaphysic that he has isn't. But he mixes things up. That's the whole thing. It's this. That's one of the things, you can't pin him down, just like Trump. I mean, again, you can't pin him down anywhere. It doesn't matter if he contradicts himself, because it doesn't matter. You're applying old rules. You're applying rules that used to work in the old world, where you had to be true and you wanted to make sure you weren't lying. But to this new world where, hey, it doesn't matter. We're creating our reality as it goes. So no, I mean, I think this is in one sense, it's either this creative blend of all this kind of stuff, or this kind of incomprehensible, incoherent mess, which I think Dugin often. As far as from what I've read, he slides in and out of one or the other. Sometimes it's it's brilliant, and other times it just becomes I don't quite get this. That it's just this kind of lather of kind of rhetoric, and mostly against, as you say, directed against the West. Directed against the twittering, buzzing, rhizomatic, Western individual who's this kind of insect. Kind of, it's just this kind. Sometimes I just find myself laughing. It's just kind of insect-looking little creatures in the West are going around, and he wants to eradicate them. He wants to just come and get rid of them all and all that. And so, I mean, I mean, one of the things too is one of the things he leaves out is that many people in the West have made the same criticisms. The West has produced its own critics. It just hasn't produced such a vehement kind of denunciation. And also, he basically is saying we can't wait around for the end of the world expecting it to happen by itself. We have to kind of get behind it and get in there and make it happen. And then once it's over, we'll settle into this new organic, theocratic traditional society, which is like a caste system where everyone's in their place. But the way he talks about it sounds like people won't even have individual minds anymore, but will be so integrated into the society and into the natural world, we'll sort of experience what he calls Dasein, which again he throws in some Heidegger in there, and that the whole idea of an individual consciousness would just sort of no longer exist, and maybe for many people that might be something they look forward to, but I mean I'm certainly aware of all the problems in the West, but when I see what he offers as an alternative, it strikes me as worse than the disease.
Right. Yeah. We're almost at an hour. I had one random question that doesn't connect to this directly, though actually there is a connection, I think, with the Kyrgyzstan and with postmodernism and whatnot. I know that you've written some article about Jordan Peterson.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
But I couldn't find it online. I think it's only in
it's not online. It's in print with a magazine called New Dawn that comes out of Australia. In fact, I mean to ask them to see if they can put it up online, because occasionally they do. Because I actually think it's a good article, so more people should read it. Yeah.
I'm curious about your take on him. Actually, now that I think about it, in my mind that connects to what we're talking about pretty directly. Because it seems to me that, well, one, he's on this crusade against postmodernism as he perceives it, and two, he might be one of the attempts to suggest a new vision after the previous one collapsed, don't you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, he interests me. In fact, it was a while ago that a Facebook correspondent suggested I check out these videos he had up on YouTube, and this is a couple of years ago by now, actually, and this is before he was very well known, and this Facebook friend said, it seemed to me that you and Peterson had some ideas in common. So I thought I'd check it out, and I found, I like these early videos, and he was feisty, he was, sort of combative, and he was engaging, and he was a very good speaker, and also he was talking about Jung and Dostoevsky, and but what really did it for me was precisely as you say, his critique of postmodernism, and what struck me was that many years ago, when I was a student, a mature student, I went back to university in the 80s and 90s, and at the time there was a famous book called The Closing of the American Mind by an American academic named Alan Bloom, and what he was critiquing was the prevalence of left-wing sort of ideology in the universities, and how all of these student radicals from the 60s had got tenure in universities, and they were teaching, basically Frankfurt School and Marcuse and stuff like that, and he felt it was undermining sort of Western education and so on. And he wasn't a conservative himself, like Peterson. He considered himself a classic liberal. He was gay and Jewish, and he belonged to more than one kind of oppressed kind of minority. But he was arguing against the kind of leftist, the saturation of leftist ideology and especially in humanities, and then when I did a stint in graduate school, I remember I was doing English Lit at a prestigious university in California, and I went back as a mature student, and it was completely taken over by all the things that Bloom was worried about a few years earlier, and I dropped out because I knew I was never going to get a job. I was white, I was male. I had no interest in deconstructing anything. All I wanted to do was really understand literature, and I was more of an old romantic humanist, and there was no place for me. So when I saw Peterson, talking about this stuff, I said, "Yeah, that's right, go for it," because he was it seemed to me that he was encountering the full-grown beast that I had encountered, when it was just quite as a cub, yeah. And then I just his whole idea about responsibility and so on and all that I just thought was very accurate and true, and I read his book, The 12 Rules, and it's a self-help book. It's not great literature. I mean, most people who have anything going for them already know more or less what he's talking about, but I can understand how its popularity. It sort of struck me as kind of like the Robert Bly of this millennial kind. If you remember this Robert Bly, his book Iron John, from, you're probably too young, in the early 90s. It was kind of like the book that was responsible for the men's movement. And again, it was similarly, men need to sort of embrace their own kind of character. They shouldn't feel guilty, and feel somehow that they're the guilty for all the evils in the world and so on and so on. And I just like how he was, and especially what I appreciated about his attack on postmodernism was precisely his attack on this nihilism that I feel has saturated everything, and so yes, I was very much for him in that article. I haven't kept up. I did the article some months ago, so I don't really touch on all of his remarks about gender pay gap and women having children and all that kind of stuff. And I know there's much more controversial stuff all around that. But for that one area where I felt that he was confronting, in a very vigorous and necessary way, this kind of, postmodern hegemony is one of the words they use themselves. So it itself had kind of become this kind of monster that, was trying to stop it from. So, yeah, I've tried to, get in touch with him in different ways, but, he became a, superstar. So, everyone's going to try and get in touch with him. But, it's a good article. In fact, you reminded me, I'll ask New Dawn if they'll put it up online.
I want to read that. Yeah. I'm really curious, like watching Peterson just as a phenomenon is very curious for me. Not even the substance of what he says, though that also has its appeal, but the fact that he now performs at, in front of 3,000-4,000 people in every city, and I guess, like, to me, I watched the when he goes out on the stage and the crowd cheers. That to me is like, these are Americans, aren't they? They're really like...
Well, again, it's he's become. I said I remember it was amazing how he became an overnight celebrity. I mean, one of the things that did it was when he came here to London and he had this interview with this TV journalist named Kathy Newman, who's very kind of right on and pro-feminist and all that, and she kind of came out wanting to kind of take him down, and he was very cool and calm, collected, stuck to the point, and she just basically lost it, and it was the complete opposite. He turned it around completely in his favor, and after that it was just like he was in all the newspapers, he was everywhere, and so I think the time is right. I know he's had some association with the alt-right. My impression is that he's tried to clarify that and a variety of different things. And I think he is trying to walk this increasingly narrow space that's not one side or the other, which to me, it just strikes me as kind of common sense and intelligence, I would say, and not getting caught up in the rhetoric either the left or the right. But I can't, good for him. He's a, psychotherapist and a psychologist, because he probably need his training in order to deal with the celebrity that he's got. So it can be quite dangerous. These things can go to your head, and you wouldn't want him to turn into a kind of demagogue. And I suspect that many people already think that that's what he's sort of doing. But more power to him.
Yeah. I mean, it seems that maybe the path that he's doing with, like, he talks about Jung and he talks about archetypes and the archetypal stories, and brings into, he's talking about responsibility and uses Pinocchio and the gospel as an example of this and that. I'm thinking maybe that's, like, at the beginning of the conversation, I said that the tongue-in-cheek approach to magic, or, some of these, like, ideas that are not strictly materialistic or scientific or whatever. That's one approach. Maybe his approach is the second that is being tried out now, with focusing on the stories, focusing on the.
Well, he's tapping into the mythic.
Right.
His first book, Maps of Meaning, which I read, and he's basically trying to devise a new way in which to understand old myths. And again, that puts him in this Jungian. Joseph Campbell, kind of, not quite. Right. Joseph Campbell was a mythographer, whereas Peterson is a behavioral psychologist, and he's also very good about relationships and things of that sort. But again, it's this kind of thing where there is a human nature. We're not blank slates. We're not tabula rasa, and on which whatever we want can be written, which I guess is the basis of the idea that we are socially constructed. So your identity, who you are, is something that is constructed by society. And I guess what Peterson's saying, and what Jung, Campbell, and Robert Bly, and also the great American psychologist Abraham Maslow, who's sort of the father of humanist psychology, he would agree with Peterson too. And he said there was sort of inbuilt biological kind of needs. There's a hierarchy of needs, and and one of them is the need to grow, to develop, and all these kind of things. So it's the sense that we're not just kind of well-meaning social planners who want to create the great society can't just get a hold of human nature and do what they want with it. This is the hyper left optimistic vision, which in one sense you'd want to say, yes, why not? This society is such a mess. Why don't we just go and do it? Well, if you try to do that, you lose out on the other side. And the other side is this idea that there's a kind of human nature. It's limited. It has certain kind of, obstacles within itself. And that's the need for religion. Religion shows you a way to confront suffering and confront, life's inequities and injustices and so and your own. You're like Peterson talks about your own shadow, your own evil, your own darkness, and all that kind of thing. And the one side is saying, no, if you just think humans are a blank slate, you do an injustice to human nature. The other side says, yes, but if you want to say that all this stuff is just natural and it's there, we can't do anything about it, and we want to make a better world. So, they've sort of been doing that for a long time. Obviously, it's some combination of both, but easier said than done. But that's what I like about him, is that, yes, it recognizes that there is some kind of something that's given. We're not born empty slates. And I would say our natures aren't completely fixed. I would say we have a evolutionary kind of character, which we do grow. We do want to have new experiences. We want to assimilate. And that's what he talks about too. The unknown. There's the known, which is safe, and then there's the unknown, which is chaos, and the hero is the one who goes out into the unknown and sort of assimilates it and expands the area of the known. And yeah, of course, So in that sense, I appreciate what he's trying to do. Unfortunately, it's in this context of everything being hyper politicized, and it just turns into this kind of factions and polarizations, which. In the book, I talk about this notion of the war of all against all, which the philosopher Hobbes said it was the state of primitive, natural man before civilization. But we seem to have reached a kind of similar state in this internet world in which we're all kind of competing for likes. On social media, we're all sort of competing with everybody else to get more likes. And then each individual group is competing against the other for its own rights and its own freedom and its own identity, and the whole notion of identity politics and all that. So, everything's fracturing into these individual little atoms who are fighting against each other. And I think that's one of the characteristics in which we live today, and we have to sort of find a way to get through it.
Yeah. Well, okay, we went over an hour.
We'll end on that happy note.
We'll see where that leads us.
Back to me next year, see what happens.
I'm really looking forward to your new book and your upcoming work. And if you are willing I'll keep you in touch, and I'll let you know as soon as it's available, and we'll arrange for an interview and all that. I'll send you a copy. Perfectly. That sounds great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye.